Hello, welcome to the symposium. My name's Carl, and I want to talk about Descartes and his demons. 17th century French philosopher René Descartes wanted to establish a system of knowledge that would prove the existence of God, understand the nature of the human mind and its distinction to the body, and establish the principles on which the material universe can be studied. So no small task. He begins by acknowledging that he has inherited a series of false beliefs from his upbringing and sets about a general demolition of his own opinions. This need not be done one by one, but instead by undermining their foundations, so that any reasoning built on top of them will just collapse naturally through its own inconsistency. Descartes identifies the problem is with the brain itself, that a madman believes he is a king while he is naked and in poverty, and he extrapolates this to explain that he can never be sure that whether he believes he is awake that he is not actually dreaming, and vice versa. How can he be sure? If he feels as if he is awake during the dream only to awaken after, then he reasonably concludes that all disciplines which rely on the study of composite things, which are things made up of other components such as physics, astronomy, medicine, etc., things that exist in the real world, are doubtful, whereas mathematics, geometry, and anything abstract and created by its own definitions, which deal with simple and general things, cannot be false. So 2 plus 3 equals 5, a square has 4 sides. These are all true whether he is awake or asleep by the definition of the terms that we're using. So the question is, for Descartes, the question is, did God create Descartes specifically in order for him to be deceived? To have him believe that there is a rich, full world without actually building such a world in which for him to exist? Why would a good God do this? Descartes, though, has to admit that not one of his former beliefs has no doubt upon which can be raised, so he has to keep them all in a state of uncertainty in his own mind. So instead of probability, he's forced to accept that there can only be probable or improbable, even if it is more reasonable to believe than deny. And so to counterbalance his innate prejudices in favour of his ingrained beliefs, he has to maintain artificial prejudices against them in order to essentially believe nothing. So to do this, he essentially imagines himself trapped by a malicious demon that has done all in its power to trick Descartes into believing that the world around him and even his own body is an illusion designed to give him a false impression of reality. He thinks that this is proof that the senses alone cannot give us adequate proof that we can be sure that the world around us actually exists. Our senses might be being fed false information. We might have no real information about the real world. How can we be sure that exists? How can we be sure that we exist? He's not an idiot about this, of course. He understands the difficulty of maintaining such a worldview and accepts that in the course of his daily life he will slip back into these old prejudices out of habit and comfort, but he's determined to maintain this position to continue exploring these ideas. And eventually, after slicing away his uncertain beliefs, he comes to the point where he believes he's found something of which he can be definitively certain, something that did not require his senses the information did not require to come from the senses. This is a thing of which that he simply has no room for doubt, and it is the famous cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So, what's Descartes trying to persuade us of? He's trying to use a kind of radical skepticism to persuade us that there is, in fact, something that we can be certain of beyond reasonable doubt. Although we can't be sure that our own sensory perception is accurate or even real, Descartes establishes that the very fact that we are able to wrestle with the question of what is and is not real, and whether we can perceive it at all, is proof enough that at least something we can describe as I is real, and from there we can attempt to figure out what else there is of which we can be certain. So he's looking for an absolute foundational belief. So our senses sometimes deceive us, so does that mean that they can't be trusted? The answer now is no, really. It means they can be trusted, essentially. Occasionally we will hear things that are wrong, catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of our eye that's not there, or think we smell or feel something that we can't corroborate. I don't know if déjà vu also fits the description of something that is a faulty sense, but it does seem to be drawn from essentially the same components. But I don't believe that just because something is not perfect, that it can never be used as a method of data gathering. Our senses are fallible, but they must be reasonably accurate. Because by everyone's accounts, we appear to share the same common understanding of the world, where we survive and prosper, and where we can be sure that we have houses, cars, computers, family and friends, etc. And everyone seems to respond to this in the same way. There's widespread agreement that these things all exist, perceived by essentially the same methods for each person, in what is generally considered to be the real world. It seems that the senses are mostly reliable, although we should undoubtedly be critical of any information they present to us, as anything incongruous should obviously be treated with skepticism. But that's not a refutation to what Descartes has said so far. Going on, is he right in saying that there are never sure signs of distinguishing between being awake and being asleep? If he's right about that, why does it call his beliefs into question? Well, I don't think that the quality and clarity of dreams is, in my opinion, indicative, an equivalent quality of the sensory experience of being awake. I feel that it's driven far more by the passions, and it feels a lot more irrational when I have a memory of a dream. And if one is to consider lucid dreaming a phenomenon, then there are times in a dream where one realizes it is a dream and can be sure they are not awake, and then choose to exit the dream, which is something I believe I've done myself as well. However, if he were to be right about it, it would necessarily call his beliefs about the world into question, as anything he had perceived to be part of the world would be forever in doubt, and it could just as easily be an imaginary construct created by his demon and not real. Fortunately for Descartes, though, even if he was unable to distinguish being awake from being asleep, it would have no effect on his ultimate conclusion that he does indeed exist. So the question then becomes, is it not easier to think a perfect God would allow me to go wrong sometimes than he would allow me to be totally in error? Is it clear why my beliefs are at all in doubt if there is no God? So I suppose it is easier to believe that a perfect God would allow me to go wrong sometimes than exist totally in error. It's hard to imagine any reason why a perfect God would desire a man to live in a state of perpetual error, and it's even more difficult to reconcile man's active existence in perpetual error with his flourishing upon the earth. If man can't accurately perceive the world, how does he survive in it? It's easier to believe that man's sense of the world is generally accurate, punctuated by occasional mistakes, than it is to believe that man knows nothing true about the world and yet thrives anyway. I do not believe it is clear that all the beliefs that we hold are in doubt if there is no God. Descartes' beliefs about mathematics are still true whether he can affirm God exists or not, for example. But his overall conclusion that we can be certain of our own existence because otherwise we would have nothing to even consider if we did not, I find to be the most persuasive point that he's made so far. I find his thought experiment of the evil demon to be the most persuasive pillar of his conclusion, even after using his radical skeptical method to destroy all his original beliefs. He is unable to dispute with himself that something must exist over which he is having the dispute to begin with. Even if an evil demon is manipulating his worldview to fool him into believing nothing but lies, Descartes must at least exist, or else what is the demon operating upon? So now we come to the question, what is the demon operating upon? Assuming it's got control of all of his sensory input. What's Descartes' opinion on the mind and the body and the connection between them? Because if the senses are a part of the body and they're feeding information to the mind, we have to have some kind of further information about this. And this is a subject that is called Cartesian Dualism. So Descartes' position is what the the thing that gives the position its name, which is Cartesian Dualism, he believed that the mind and body were of two totally different sorts. Minds were immaterial and so not physical, and are connected to people's bodies, which I presume means their brains, through causal interactions, and these causal interactions meant that occurrences that happened in someone's mind would have an effect on the body and vice versa, but it's really not clear exactly what that is, and most modern philosophers reject Cartesian dualism as science doesn't appear to support it. Which is the benefit of massive amounts of hindsight. But I think it is worth going through why Descartes believed what he believed. But anyway, he believed the conscious experiment the conscious experience, is present in the world as long as the immaterial mind is there. Materialists claim that everything is physical, and most scientists are materialists to some degree, which creates a problem understanding how the non-physical elements to the human experience exist. Consciousness, rationality, self-awareness all need to be explained in a physical world that is otherwise devoid of the immaterial characteristics. And Descartes defined consciousness as an intimate source of knowledge with which every person has about their own mental occurrences. He focuses on what he himself is in this regard. And that's a fine definition to use, I suppose. In the second meditation, Descartes establishes that he can be certain that he exists because he is a thinking being, and the very act of thought is proof that, no matter how uncertain the rest of his experience might be, the very fact that he has an existence is not in doubt. I am, for example, he says, I exist, that is certain, but for how long? For as long as I am thinking. After establishing the existence of I, he then establishes that he knows nothing about I, and must be at great pains to establish exactly what I actually is. He forgoes using abstract terminology that would require further explanation, such as calling himself a rational animal. Well, what's an animal? What does rational mean? And instead describes the mechanical nature of his body. He describes his hands, face, limbs, etc. He examines what a body is. He says that it's something with a determinable shape, a definite location, it occupies space in such a way to exclude other bodies. It is a thing that we can identify. It can be perceived with the senses and moved by external force, but according to Descartes, it does not have the power of self-movement. In the same way that Descartes believed that the body did not have the power of sensation, movement was an effect of the soul, which is presumably a synonym for mind, but it's the effect of the soul upon the body. He believes that he is a thinking thing, and something that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, is willing, is unwilling, and also imagines and has sensory perceptions, all of which are modes of thought in his opinion. So the sensory perceptions are actually a product of the immaterial, a quality of the immaterial mind, not the body, as I mistakenly said a minute ago. So, although Descartes can't be certain about his perception of reality, that the world and the people in it cannot be proven to be real, even if the powerful, though not omnipotent demon, because surely an omnipotent demon could persuade him that 2 and 2 and 3 equal 6, or a square has 12 sides, or something like that. It could surely change reality if it was omnipotent to make that the case. But the powerful demon has caught him in his trap and can deceive him entirely about the remaining nature of reality. The demon cannot convince Descartes that Descartes himself does not exist, because for that to be true, the demon would have no subject to deceive in the first place. For the demon to deceive Descartes, Descartes must exist in some form. No matter how peculiar a thought process the demon is able to twist Descartes into believing, the one thing he cannot make Descartes believe is that in the lack of his own existence. His own thoughts guarantee his existence in some capacity. Descartes doesn't really put much stock in his own imagination when it comes to having a role in finding out anything about the world. He is aware that his understanding of the world comes from his sensory perception, and that in the thought experiment the malicious demon has already nullified the validity of any sensory perception. So in the first meditation, he observes that artists don't actually innovate something that didn't previously exist, but instead they jumble up pre-existing characteristics of animals and humans to form new but not wholly original creations. Returning to the second meditation, he believes that his imagination is incapable of inventing anything original because it would involve him envisaging the shape or image of a corporeal thing. Anything he could envisage would be a dream or a chimera, based on information fed to his thought processes through his senses. Nothing he could imagine would be a reliable source of information about the essential thing that Descartes actually is. There are, of course, many academic refutations to Descartes' worldview, and a really interesting one comes from Professor Sir Peter Strawson, who in Self, Mind and Body argues against Cartesian dualism in favour of a unitary view of human beings. He believed that while there was merit to the Cartesian position, it was wrong, and human beings were not made up of two different things, mind and body separately. He says, the anti-Cartesian thesis is not the thesis that there are no such thing as minds, but the concept of an individual mind or consciousness is only to be understood as logically derivative from the concept of an individual person. This is really interesting. Strawson observed that it is often not straightforward to separate out the properties of minds and bodies in a way that distinguished one from another. He uses the terms subject, the person or mind, and predicate, the property of the subject, and ascribing, which is how we determine what predicate belongs to what subject. In the relevant section of Self, Mind and Body that deals with Descartes, Strawson deconstructs the Cartesian argument as follows. If Cartesian dualism was correct, and the mind was a separate thing to the body, it should be possible to construct a grammatical dualism to describe the distinctions between the mind and the body without referring to one another. Strawson believed that we should be able to take common English methods of describing the individual and reconstruct them using Cartesian grammar to create three possibilities of reconstruction. So the first one, being the grammatical subject of the new statement, would be the designation of a body or part of a body, or it would be the designation of a mind or a consciousness, or the original statement would be analysed into two separate statements, one about the mind and one about the body, having separate meanings that did not mean the same thing. English already has many words in which we do apply predicates, properties, to either the mind or the body, which appear to implicitly confirm Descartes' position. However, Strawson points out that the anti-Cartesian position observes that these are recursive predicates that emanate from the presupposed individual. So, to talk about John's mind, one must first have the concept of John. We cannot talk about a property of John's mind without also referring to a thing that Cartesian dualism would hold to be a separate subject, as in the physical property of John. John's mind is an aspect of John and John's physical presence. His body, however, that is altered or constituted, is as inseparable to John as the concept of John is to the concept of John's mind. Without a body, there is no John. Without a John, there is no John's mind. So Strawson imagines that the Cartesian would say that we are naturally hampered by our primitive language and our linguistics, and this does not actually disprove Cartesian dualism. Strawson imagines that the Cartesian would naturally come out and say, well, look, we're hampered by our primitive linguistics. We weren't designed to be able to think this complexly, and just because we lack the language for it doesn't mean that you're actually disproving the Cartesian dualist theory. But Strawson goes on to demonstrate that we can't talk about someone's mind without also considering what the body is doing at the same time. And if we attempt to divorce the concept of John's mind from John, then we are only left with the mind, of which we cannot even be sure that we can use the term the. How do we know it's only one mind? Have we not just obliterated the concept of the individual? We can't talk coherently of one thing or another unless we can know the difference between one such item and two such items. How can we address a mind if we don't know how to distinguish it from any other mind? We cannot seem to identify John's mind without reference to John, and by extension, John's body. How do we clearly define the mind we are trying to address? We cannot clearly define it, and if we cannot clearly define it, how do we know we are even talking about it? The anti-Cartesian position has instead very defined boundaries. John is a person. A person has many properties. One of these properties is consciousness. To count the number of minds, we need only count the number of people. The Cartesian finds himself unable to argue the difference between one soul and many. The mind, consciousness, or soul, whatever it is not dependent on the body. How is it identified and determined? It appears that we are invited to simply make up whatever mechanism we feel suits best. Strawson felt that the anti-Cartesian arguments were the only way that we could be sure that a man's mind, consciousness, or soul is actually a part of the man. These arguments are partly logical, partly epistemological in character. The arguments regarding recursive predicates are logical. The arguments about how to identify John's mind from others are epistemological, as in what logically follows, or how do we know what it is that we believe. So it seems that Strawson has Descartes pinned. It looks like he's correct and Descartes is wrong. It's difficult to know what I or my represents in Descartes' conception. If he's talking specifically about the experience of a soul, we cannot know it because he is using language that also refers to an individual's physical body. As Strawson had previously demonstrated, we cannot know that Descartes' I refers to one individual mind, or the mind that Descartes believes he is referencing is even his. The term I refers to one identifiable person, and as Strawson says, when one becomes introspective about the term, it becomes misty and hard to pin down. And I mean, it is difficult to know what Descartes is trying to refer to when he refers to I, think, therefore I am. Well, what is this I? Define it, Descartes. It seems to me that Strawson has Descartes pinned in a way that prevents Descartes from escaping without inventing some fanciful solution off the top of his head. He can't identify how a soul is tethered to the body. He can't provide reasons why any particular mind operates on any particular body. Like, why should one mind not operate on another body or every body? Who knows? If a man is a composite of a human body and a human mind and all facets thereof, Descartes can't describe how the mind and body connect. No matter how Descartes tries to wriggle out of this hold, Strawson could presumably respond by logically demonstrating that the mind is contingent on the body and must therefore be generated by it in some way, which prevents Descartes from continuing to position that they are actually two separate entities. I really do feel that the best Descartes could do in this position is appeal to the inadequacy of the language for providing correct terminology to describe what Descartes believes he is attempting to transmit, but this is not a refutation of Strawson's position and leaves Descartes effectively stuck. I hope you found this interesting. I've been working a lot on this sort of thing, and I figure that since I have notes that effectively sound like video scripts, I may as well go through them and put them up because maybe you'd find it interesting too. Let me know whether you enjoyed this in the comments. Hopefully it was just gave you something interesting to think about and help you pass the time at work or something like that, because this is what most of my day is filled with and I really enjoy it, and I was thinking it might be fun to share.